Hello, I'm Katrina Jackson from Science and Technology Australia. It's a real pleasure to see so many people here today to discuss one of the most important issues of our time. Indeed, you will have heard Al Gore and others describe climate change as the moral issue of our time. The latest IPCC report tells us that the threat to human health is absolutely unprecedented. We're delighted today to bring you a distinguished panel to discuss these issues. And in fact, including one of the authors of that IPCC report. In just a moment, Genevieve Jacobs from the ABC will introduce the panellists in detail and kick things off properly. But before that, I would like to very profoundly thank the Inspiring Australia program in the Department of Industry and the Federal Government for supporting this program, not just with the funds to make sure it happens, but with vigorous involvement throughout all the programs. And I'm very pleased to note the presence of a number of people, including Brenton Honeyman in the front row there. Also, I'd like to thank the research training at the Australian National University for their support of this program. There'll be plenty of time to ask questions during the forum. Part of the point of these is to have as much interaction as possible. We're also filming the event, so we can load it up onto YouTube for those who couldn't attend or for those who'd like to see a repeat later. So please wait till the microphone gets to you when you're asking a question. We'll be running around with them and popping them into your hands. Now that all remains, if you're a tweeter, and I'm sure there are some vigorous tweeters in the room here, please feel free to tweet throughout the proceedings using the hashtag #MakingUsSick. I know some of you will have no idea what that means, but some do. Now all that remains is to turn off your mobile phones or any other device that beeps, buzzes or vibrates in an unpleasant fashion. And Genevieve, take it away.
Thanks, Katrina. And good afternoon, everyone. Hello, I'm Genevieve Jacobs from 666 ABC Canberra, where I host the mornings program. And I'm really very pleased indeed to be with you for another vigorous discussion for the Science and Technology Association, because science is truly at the heart of everything, isn't it? When we talk science, we talk about the building blocks of our world. And as we look today at climate change and health, we're looking at potentially major changes to the way those building blocks are aligned in this country. Australia, what a beautiful country, what spectacular views, what extraordinary landscapes and lifestyles. I was at a launch just yesterday of a new tourism strategy focused around food and wine, and everything looked so glorious. And of course, here we are today, wondering how well we'll be poised to be able to enjoy that in another 20, 30, 50 or 100 years' time. As Katrina said, according to the latest IPCC report on climate change, it poses a potentially catastrophic threat to our way of life on the planet. And here in Australia, we have that unique combination of a very much first world lifestyle and expectations surrounding it, and this fragile climate. So we are vulnerable. On the panel today, three distinguished speakers. To my left, Tony McMichael is Professor Emeritus of Health at the Australian National University. And for over a decade, from 2001, he headed the research program on population health risks of climate change. Next to him, Dr. Peter Tait, who's been a GP for 32 years, 29 of those spent in Aboriginal health in Central Australia. He's been with us here in Canberra since 2011, where he continues to work as a GP. He's an adjunct senior lecturer at the ANU's medical school and also involved in climate change research at the University of New South Wales and the ANU. At the far end from me, Professor Barbara Norman, who's the Foundation Chair of Urban and Regional Planning in the Faculty of Business, Government and Law at the University of Canberra, Director of Canberra Urban and Regional Futures, and an adjunct professor at the ANU. She also chairs the Climate Change Council here in the ACT, and she's the Deputy Chair of Regional Development Australia. Sustainable planning is very much at the heart of Barbara's interests, and she was a contributing author to the IPCC 5WG2 report on impacts this year. Now, I'll have some questions to start the conversation, but as Katrina said, today is very much about you. And if over the last 7 or 8 years with the ABC I have learned anything about Canberra audiences, it's that they are full of well-informed questions, ideas and comments, usually very well-informed indeed. So we do have a couple of roving microphones in the room. Just raise your hands, catch my eye, and we'll get the microphone to you. And please do just wait until you receive it before you say anything. You should tweet. If you're a citizen of the Twitter sphere, go to it. I may have told you this story before, but at 666 in the green room, we have a sign saying, "Don't just sit there, tweet." which always amuses me. I think, yes, don't go to the loo, don't have a glass of water, don't clear your throat, just tweet. Let people know you exist. But let's go to it. Peter, let me start with you. Why should we be worried about something like climate change when we don't fully understand the consequences yet, and we're only just beginning to see the impacts?
If we think about health, and we think about what makes us well as people, in my life as a GP, I've discovered that, you know, you can see people, you can treat them being sick, but underneath that, people get sick because of how we arrange society. And then as I worked through this, I became aware that actually underneath that, how society works is dependent on the natural cycles that keep us with fresh air, clean water, soil that can grow crops, the crops themselves, the insect that supports the growing of crops, and it also feeds into the insects that can make us sick. And so that is what is going to get damaged if we change the climate from what it's been like for the last 10,000 years to what it is looked like it is going to be in less than 50 to 70 years' time.
And Peter, let me challenge you on how interdependent humanity and the environment are. There would be those who argue that we can manipulate this to our own advantage, that these are changes that we can manage and that we're in charge of that to some extent.
Hubris.
Hubris.
I think the point is that we are already seriously manipulating the environment, and it looks like we're not doing a very good job of the experiment. I think that doesn't mean we can back out. I think it is too late for us to back out from playing with the environment. We need to change how we're doing it. We need to be informed by what the science is telling us, and we need to be taking on a stewardship role, a custodial role, treading lightly, but at the same time taking some responsibility for our actions. We're interdependent. I mean, if you just think that, you know, if we... I mean, let's do a thought experiment. We could grow food in plastic troughs with water, with artificial chemicals in it, in caves or on a spaceship. But is that the sort of earth we want to be living in? Or do we want to still be growing crops in soil where they're going to taste like crops that have been grown in soil? Are we still going to have soil to grow them in?
Tony, where do we begin to assess the health risks then? How do we factor in what we might need to consider over the next few decades?
Well, I think, Genevieve, there's a very big issue here that we ought to have in mind as we have this discussion. And that is that to the extent that human health has been included at all in the public discourse on climate change and its consequences, it's been at a fairly predictable and I would say in many respects rather trivial level. Heat waves and the way they kill people, it's an important issue, but it's not the only one, and yet it's the one that we are most familiar with because it's immediately understood by all of us. Many of us have experienced the stress of heat waves, so we understand that's a problem. We also understand that extreme weather events, things like the Queensland floods, for example, which I believe were partly exacerbated by the much warmer Western Pacific Ocean sea surface and evaporation rates and dumps of rain. Those sorts of extreme weather events are also becoming reasonably well understood. But I think the picture that we're not getting is that, as Peter was implying, in a very big sense, human well-being, human health, human physical survival is the bottom line in all of this, because in the medium to longer term, the adverse effects on human health are going to flow through disruptions to those systems that we depend on, that you've referred to, the food-producing system, the flows of fresh water and its quality, the natural constraints on activity and distributions of infectious diseases, the protective effects of physical buffers, coasts, forests, wetlands, and so on. All of these things are being pressured and threatened now by climate change, and as they weaken or disappear, so the range of threats to human health will inevitably increase. So I think it is important to understand that, yes, there are upfront things that are immediately obvious to us and which we must do things about to reduce deaths in heat waves now, but there are, for oncoming generations at least, if not for us in the next decade or two, these more fundamental disruptions of the life support system. And I would concur with Peter has said, we've really lost sight as a modern, urbanised, sophisticated society of the extent to which the very basics of human well-being, health and physical survival depend on the continued functioning of those natural life support systems out there.
But this is a difficult proposition, isn't it? Because we're continually expanding our understanding of how climate change might affect the planet. And just in the last couple of weeks, for example, we've had those very complex and fascinating findings about how both wind patterns are keeping parts of Antarctica cool but drawing moisture away from southern Australia. And at the same time, the rate of melt in the West Antarctic ice fields is much faster than anticipated. So the climate systems are not fully understood by any means. So how do we begin to assess the risks for us when we're operating in the fields of supposition and sometimes just making informed guesses?
Well, that's a very good question, and one that you should pose to the researchers, to the scientists. And I think part of the answer has to be that as a society, we can't expect science to continue to perform in classical white-coated fashion and appear with relatively precise results from well-controlled experiments. We can't do that in relation to most of the impacts of climate change, particularly, of course, in the longer term. And that will, incidentally, of course, be taking us well beyond the bounds of human experience from natural climate change over the last 10,000 years, when things have been reasonably stable climatically and we've been able to commence and develop farming and urbanisation and ultimately industrialisation. We're now on the brink of moving beyond that boundary and possibly well beyond it. And of course, there are all sorts of future thresholds that will pass, feedbacks that will come into play that we haven't encountered before. So we're going to have to learn more about or come to terms with making decision-making under conditions of uncertainty. That's the nature of the world around us, and particularly as we disrupt it. And that doesn't come comfortably to a lot of people who expect science to be more exact than that and more piecemeal. And of course, many of our poorly informed parliamentarians also carry that mental model of what science could do. So you may be frustrated and saying, when's this guy going to answer the question about how do we assess the risks? But that's a prelude to saying that some things we can assess pretty well. We know from studies in places like Fiji and Peru and so on with respect to lower income countries that the rates of diarrheal disease go up by about 7% for each 1 degree centigrade rise in average temperature. We've got measures like that on some of the simple relationships. So we can say, well, if temperatures rise by 2 degrees centigrade in Lima, Peru, we would expect about a 10 to 15% rise in diarrheal disease hospitalizations. We can do the same for heat waves. But if it comes to saying, how will the nutrition of the world be in the 2070s as a consequence of the very many direct and indirect influence of climate change on food yields, that gets quite difficult, particularly as climate change doesn't act on its own. It's part of a big syndrome, the global environmental change syndrome, which includes a lot of things that this audience will be well aware of, that involve stratospheric ozone depletion, biodiversity loss, and so on. The list goes on. Climate change is part of that, and many of its impacts are a result of its acting in concert with those other influences, and you can imagine particularly that that's the case for food yields. So the answer is that for many of these health risks to human populations, we're going to be dealing in semi-quantitative terms and sometimes not even quantitative, just saying that it's quite clear that undernutrition rates are going to increase in much of South Asia and much of sub-Saharan Africa on current trajectories, and that will be a serious problem. Don't ask me how many kids exactly will die. We cannot say.
Barbara, sorry, Peter.
And if I can add in there, please, I think this argument that we need certainty to take action is a red herring, because as Tony was saying, we know enough, and we know enough about the trends that we can say that we're going to somewhere where we don't want to go. In the natural resource management cycle, there is a concept called adaptive governance, or they call it adaptive management, but it's now being lifted out of natural resource management into a general thing of adaptive governance. And adaptive governance is all about realising that you're going somewhere you don't want to go, taking action, getting the feedbacks from what happens from your action and continue to adapt what you're doing as you go along. So we have processes that we know we can do this. We're not paralysed by any means. We have mechanisms that we can employ.
Barbara, I wanted to put that question to you, deriving from what Tony said. It's a truism that there are no votes in preventative health care. No one ever comes up to a parliamentarian and says, thank you so much for persuading me not to take up smoking 25 years ago so that I didn't have a stroke last week. And I wonder whether you think governments are factoring this kind of thinking into their action on population health. Is there an awareness that is building that we actually see action at government level on the kinds of scenario that Tony was just describing?
Well, I think there might be the beginnings of that. I think we have a long way to go. But certainly in my field, which is urban and regional planning, sustainable cities, we're starting to see the growth of a movement around healthy cities, for example. And I guess today we're talking about healthy cities in the context of climate change. And so I think that's heartening, if I could say that. and it's a strategy that's interesting some of our political leaders, and certainly the local chief minister, and anyone who's been a minister for health is interested. I think the quantum of expense on the other side of the ledger of healing people after they're sick is becoming so large that attention is necessarily turning to preventative health and the way we design our cities. So urban design, better urban planning is coming through more and more strongly from a whole range of discussions that I have. So I think there is just the beginnings of that, and I see it in the UN agenda, I see it UN Habitat and the Developing Nations agenda. I see it being reflected in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and Jeffrey Sachs and people like that, who was here last week, introducing cities and healthy cities into that. So there is hope there, yes.
And it's interesting to consider the costs for government that this possibly poses, and they are astronomical. But I wonder, Barbara, in that context of healthy cities, whether we're also considering the effects on our economy and communities from health risks associated with climate change.
I wish I could be more optimistic. I think, yes, we are considering, in research, yes. National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility, which Tony McMichael and others have contributed enormously to that agenda. But whether actually seeing that in the political debate, I don't think so yet, to be honest.
Yes, I'd like to add something on this costs question, because really there's a quite big uncashed dividend out there for us in a more localised sense with respect to climate change and health, and that is that if we were being progressive and taking the mainstream mitigation, climate abatement actions, a lot of things about our environment would be different and more health promoting. Now, I might just mention 3 or 4 of them, obvious ones, without going through details, but if we had a different mix of power generation, electricity generation, the air would become cleaner. If we were less reliant on internal combustion cars in our cities, our increasingly congested cities, not Canberra yet, but it's on the way, the local air would be cleaner. And we'd also be more often out of the cars and walking to a bus stop or riding a bike or walking to work or whatever. If we had better climate proofing of our houses, our suburbs, our buildings, in many ways that would be protective of health, less exposure to extremes of cold and heat. And of course, a big one, and it's controversial, but the food system that we have developed industrially and now increasingly intensively as populations get larger and we try to export more from this country, for example. That food industry or that food production system is responsible for about 1/4 of the global greenhouse gas emissions, and about half of that 1/4 comes from the livestock sector. That's the sector that's giving us more red meat than we need on average each day, coming from ruminant animals with 2 stomachs who burp up a lot of methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. In fact, the average Aussie cow burps up about 500 litres of methane a day. It's a front-end problem with the cow, not back-end. Cartoonists think it's the latter. But it's regurgitation and burping up of enteric methane from this particular digestive system that the sheep, the cows, the goats, the camels, etc. have. So big changes could be made on all those fronts that in many ways would flow through to better health for the community that sets those changes in motion.
But I wonder what sector of the community those go to, and it just occurs to me as you're speaking, Tony, that what you're describing is one of those achievable things for the well-heeled Canberran living in their well-designed house, eating their organically produced vegetables, walking along their wide and open roads. But perhaps, Peter, I can go to you on who is most vulnerable in terms of the impact on health from climate change.
Yeah, well, it's all of us. I mean, even us well-heeled Canberrans are already beginning to feel the impacts with the hot days and the hot nights that we're getting. But of course, as with most other things in society, the people who are the least advantaged and the more peripheral always wear the consequences worst. So the people who are living out in Oaks Estate and you know, the outer reaches of Tuggeranong are going to be more affected than we are in the sort of central suburbs. And of course, people who are living in country towns are going to be more affected than us. Remote Aboriginal communities are going to be more affected. But people who are living on small island states in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, people who are living in Bangladesh and lots of places in Central Asia are going to be much worse affected than we are. And as an ethical issue, given that it's the North, the industrialised nations that have caused the problem and are going to wear less of the impact, we need to factor that into the consideration as well. And if I could just chuck in as a non sequitur there, building a bit on what Tony was saying, I mean, we have actually global warming, climate change, global environmental change is providing us with some opportunities to actually change how we run society so that we can make it better. And Tony gave some very good examples about how in our own lives we can change our diet and our transport and our energy arrangements, but we can also be exporting those things overseas. And we can stop, you know, the Chinese and the Bangladeshis and the Indians go through the high red meat consumption cycle, moving ourselves on and making it cool to eat chicken and insects and stuff like that, so that, you know...
There was a challenge laid down at the beginning for, I think, Peter to insert cool into his conversation. The next challenge was groovy. So, Barbara Norman, let me put that to you. Are these groovy solutions that we've been discussing only first world solutions?
Oh, no, I don't think so. And this discussion around the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals is exactly that. It's about solutions that go across both developed and developing nations, which I think is a really big step forward in that debate. Your question originally to me, I think, was, is there an increased awareness, understanding? And I was really reluctant to say yes politically, because if anything, we've gone backwards in recent months, significantly in my view. But are there smart solutions out there and good research? Absolutely. So it's how we connect those two is the kind of new diabolical problem, I suspect. In terms of cities, Ban Ki-moon has said consistently in the last 2 or 3 years, since Rio 20, that the pathway solutions to climate change is through our cities. Okay. So if we start to look at the connecting urbanisation with the issue of climate change and with the issue of obesity, and Australia seems to have won the medal of becoming more obese than the Americans recently. And so if you start to look at those 3 big issues, that's the challenge in the future. In terms of smart solutions, even back here in Canberra, in our town, we seem to be doing some really exciting work. Targets of renewable energy, 90% by 2020 is incredibly exciting. I spoke to a leader, name I won't mention, of renewable energy in this nation just on Monday night in Sydney. Said, could we run Canberra 100% on renewable? He said, absolutely yes. So, if there's a willingness, we can. I don't know if it'd be 100%, but sort of 90-something, and that's what we're heading towards. So some light rail, if I dare mention that in this community, will start a huge debate, but that's another positive direction in my view in switching from cars to public transport. A lot of that's about reducing emissions in our cities and reducing the impacts that are already, in some parts, locked in for the future.
And I'd like
Adaptation, though, is another discussion which I'd like to come back to later. Then.
Look, I'd like to throw the floor open to questions. We've got a good solid hour to continue this conversation, so just pop your hand up and we'll get the microphone to you. I think we've got one just up there, and we've got another one. The microphone's just being brought down to you. But yeah, go ahead, please.
Thanks. Just a question for the panel. Nature magazine today, journal Nature just was talking about the number of deaths due to indoor air pollution, due to people cooking on small biomass-driven stoves in enclosed spaces. And it struck me that highlights a fundamental tension in the problem here. If as a public health official, you could solve those people's immediate health problem by giving them fossil fuel-driven grid energy or gas versus the long-term risk of climate change, how would you choose?
Yes, I think
I know.
Great question. No, I don't think it's fine.
It's quite correct that there is a vast health and mortality toll in the back blocks of the world from the burning of low-grade fuels in unventilated little houses. It surprised most of the epidemiologists working in privileged Western societies to have found out in the last decade that the number of annual deaths occurring from that source that you describe annually is 2 to 3 times greater than the global total from urban industrial air pollution in big cities in the developed and rapidly developing world. So it is a huge problem. The answer is not to provide them with coal to burn. The answer is much smarter than that, and it's beginning to happen. In India now, there's a program to distribute a vast number of something like 100 million stoves that have been particularly designed for these poor rural communities that use a higher grade energy source and a much better, a lower emissions and better ventilation system. Now, that at the same time, of course, is going to reduce the emissions of many of the greenhouse gases, including not just carbon dioxide, but methane, which comes off quite a few of these sources, and black carbon, fine particulate black carbon, which has been identified remarkably as a very potent greenhouse warming agent, something we didn't know 10 years ago. Just a reminder of the uncertainty of the science as we move forward here. But yes, it's a big public health challenge, it's immediate, but much of the solution will actually contribute to the mitigation of global climate change at the same time.
And I think sometimes quite low-tech solutions can be the answer to this. And I've done a number of stories with a young fellow called Sonny Forsyth who has a charity called Abundant Water, which is about going to villages and using very low-tech, locally made clay water filters. Now, water quality, as the planet warms, as we face the kinds of challenges that we're talking about, is a critical question. And yet he's managed to find an innovative technology that's very adaptable and very accessible. So perhaps it's imagination as much as anything.
And innovation. And
yes.
Solar, I think, Tony, I think solar energy at that very small scale is also being experimented with in India.
Yeah. Up here, yes?
I'm interested in the aspect of Canberra and government move towards reducing emissions, and I must say I'm a bit despondent about it. But just looking at one example to me, if you look at our bus service, we're wasting about 30 or 50 million a year on that. At the end of this term of government, we'll have had 16 years of Labor government with 8 of Green holding the balance of power, and we will have wasted the Gun Garland to Civic Light Rail. I think people individually are capable of doing something, as the uptake of solar panels, but I think government, and ours is the best example of an intelligent, well-paid community, simply lacks the ability to do anything.
It's very hard to wean us off our cars. Barbara?
Right. That's a very good question and goes to the heart of many of the challenges, so thank you. So people in Canberra have a fantastic lifestyle and do enjoy the use of their car And, maybe once, in the 50s, we took the advice of our American planners who came over and they put the major roads in, and, perhaps in hindsight it would have been better if they put in the rail at that time, but we got the roads. And we've designed our suburbs around that. We can only do so much, I guess, in terms of retrofitting that, and light rail is part of that. I'm not sure of your view about that, but it is about that. If you're going to have nearly 100,000 people at some point at Gungahlin, let's not repeat the mistakes of the past, and let's put in a more effective rapid transit system. And so I think that's a good move. And because it's fixed and it's certain, it's then reliable and people can rely on it. But in terms of how we design our new suburbs, I think that's the challenge. And how we carefully build up density, and this will get very controversial here because I know that in Canberra, in our inner suburbs is also the other part. At the end of the day, if we want to reduce trips, we need to have what we call location and access to services and shorten those trips, and also have access to public transit. I think both of those things are important. To do that, we need to have more mixed density developments like Braddon, places like that. People have said, that's changed so quickly. Braddon has changed, and people have said, oh, what's happening in Braddon, and are we fearful of that? And now we've got Kingston residents saying, we want Braddon. We want Braddon in our place, or we want something like that. I think that's a good change. How we design our city in the future is very important at this point, but building in principles about better public transport, access to services, shortening those trips. We mentioned ventilation before. I actually think we should mandate natural ventilation in housing. Very simple thing to do in the ACT, but we don't at this point. Siting, design, access to open space. We're talking about health. But all those things are connected, I guess, and we need to understand that as well. Mm-hmm. It's very hard to give a whole 4-year degree on planning at this discussion, but the opportunities are there. And what I really like about Canberra is its size, its medium size, and only one government. We're not dealing with 20-something local councils, as you would be in inner Sydney. We're dealing with quite a lot of like minds in this town, so I think we're largely on the same page, if some of the solutions might differ, and I think there's a willingness to do it. We don't have much money, that's a problem, but if we can come up with some smart technology. Can I just say one more? I know I've been going on, but one more thing I would like to say at this point. We have the benefit of fantastic national research institutions in this city, and we need to be better linking the research that's coming out of places like ANU, University of Canberra, CSIRO, with our local government decision-making and this community, because I do think we've got the capacity to show great leadership in this town.
But I think, as our questioner just asked, perhaps it's all the more remarkable that we haven't kicked so many more of those goals in this city where there would seem to be abundant opportunities to do so. And if we think about the planning aspects and how they connect with health in particular, we don't see those templates in reasonably recent developments. The very recent developments, yes, but the enormous amount of Gungahlin which does not facilitate engagement or health or dependence on public transport at all, does it?
Look, I agree with that, and I worked in the government in the ACT in the 90s, and I went back to Melbourne for family reasons during the noughties, and worked with really innovative places, City of Melbourne, and I was at RMIT and other places doing really innovative work. When I came back, I'd noticed a really big change in this city, and I don't know what the reason was. The young people, I think partly we're a community now. We have a younger generation coming through full of ideas, so we have young people who are going to live and work here, so they're interested in the future. We now have graduate planners who are born here at the University of Canberra who are really interested in participating in the decision making. So I think we have much more depth of experience and talent here. I also know that we have some very experienced people from around Australia who've decided to come and work in Canberra on these issues right now. On the light rail, the new head of Environment Sustainable Development Directorate, she's fantastic. The new head of the National Capital Authority, I know he's very experienced, got some very interesting and progressive ideas. It's almost a window of opportunity right now in Canberra. We've got some very talented people who've come in just in the last 2 or 3 years, and I think we should make the most of that.
Okay. We've got another question. I'm sorry, just behind you. We've got another question up here, and we'll get the microphone to you, madam, too. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Oh, hi. I arrived late, so I may have missed it. You may have already addressed this issue. The problem with the movement away from the equator of various diseases, particularly mosquito-borne diseases, and of those, of particular concern is malaria. What does the panel think can be done about that issue?
And Tony, vector-borne diseases are a really big issue with climate change, aren't they? The spread of these diseases into areas where they were previously restricted.
Well, it's a big question, and we certainly know that the little creatures, the mosquitoes, the ticks and so on, that are the vectors that spread diseases like malaria, viral dengue fever, and so on, are very sensitive to climatic conditions, temperature, rainfall, humidity. So the expectation is that something about their geographic distribution, their seasonality, their altitudinal range will change under climate change conditions. But these are complex ecologies, particularly a disease that is a particularly Australian disease, Ross River virus disease, for example, where the natural host are the kangaroos and the wallabies. Whereas with dengue, prevalent in northern Queensland from time to time, it's only a mosquito-human virus relationship. But with Ross River virus, if you're trying to study and anticipate how its distribution might change in Australia in future, you've got to be thinking about the demography, the ecology of the kangaroo and the wallaby, the so-called macropod populations, in relation to a possible spillover then via mosquitoes into humans. So many of these are complex relationships, and we don't yet have a good way of modelling how different scenarios of climate change will affect all of these different diseases in different parts of the world. For the moment, it's looking as if the thing that's most likely to change with a disease like malaria is really its geographic distribution rather than its total area. Some areas will become less malaria prone, others will become more malaria prone. Some of it will move up the slopes of the mountains so that it'll go to higher altitudes and encompass previously protected populations. In Eastern Africa, of course, that's a worry for Nairobi and Harare down in Zimbabwe, both of which are at relatively high altitude but are beginning now to experience an influx of the mosquitoes that spread these diseases. So the question's a good one. The answer is a complex one. We're going to learn as we go from empirical observations, and that will improve our modelling. We'll know better then how to predict the likely changes in yet further decades. But we need to be on alert that, yes, those diseases are sensitive, and it's not just the vector-borne, of course. There is the more mundane prospect of increases in what we think of as summertime gastroenteritis, food poisoning. Salmonella, Campylobacter, these organisms are sensitive to temperature. And it wouldn't be surprising if some of the increase we've seen in Salmonella occurrence in Australia over the last several decades is attributable to the underlying warming. It's hard to nail it down at this stage, but questions like that are now real and potentially very important one, particularly, Peter, for some of the remote and more vulnerable communities likely to be exposed to poor water supply or poorly refrigerated foods.
And I would imagine too, and perhaps Tony or Peter, you might like to comment on this, there is a number of other things apart from vector-borne diseases, common illnesses where there's a climate change impact. For instance, this is already hay fever and allergy central. This is a real hot point for that. That's often prompted by pollens, by natural factors. A change in climate might extend or alter the range of allergenic plants, and then there's a cascade into asthma, which can be something that's life-limiting, can sometimes be fatal.
Yes, that's very much on the agenda. Peter might have seen some of it in general practice, but certainly it's an issue in eastern USA, where they've documented increases in these allergic respiratory diseases during the ragweed pollen season, which has been extending with the increasing warmth. So we must expect some shifts of some kind in the amount and the pattern of asthma and hay fever in Australia. And interestingly, the amount of pollen that is produced by many of these plants is not just a function of the temperature and the rainfall, it's also a function of the carbon dioxide concentration in the air. There is a subgroup of plants that are quite responsive to an increase in carbon dioxide, at least within a limited warming range, and some of those will be pollen producers.
Peter, could I put that to you too? We don't really completely understand the picture for allergies and asthma as it is, and why we're so prone to it here, what those factors are. But are you seeing those increases in general practice?
The thing with sitting in general practice is that you're not really documenting stuff on an epidemiological level, and so it's very hard to make a comment like that. I mean, I have had people come in and see me in the last few weeks during this superbly warm Indian summer who have been complaining of allergies and who have been noticing that, in previous years they have not had it, but that's sort of soft and dodgy evidence.
It's difficult. Here's the anecdotal evidence of all anecdotal evidence. Phil Clark, the 666 breakfast presenter, and I both have asthma. Neither of us can work out why we're having it in autumn, far more than we ever used to. But it's present for both of us. And I think we had a question down here.
I just want to go back to the issue of food production and the reference to bucolic cows. And that's often associated in discussions with our need as good citizens to eat less red meat, more fish perhaps, if there are enough fish available, and a high proportion of vegetables and cereals. But as standards of living rise in second and third world countries, apparently the desire for red meat escalates. But another aspect of our diet, which is regarded as important for adequate nutrition, is dairy foods. And when we go into our supermarkets, there is a tremendous range of dairy products available. And I just wonder whether in the future how we're going to, in a responsible way, meet that need for dairy consumption, rather than this ongoing focus on, reducing our consumption of red meat.
Tony, do you have thoughts?
Well, it's one of those answers, I think, that has to invoke this idea of moderation in all things. Not in my mind is there any suggestion that we must move to a vegetarian world in order to make it sustainable. That, I believe, is not necessary, but we do need to understand the relative energy inefficiency of these different types of animals that we eat as meat. So, and the least energy efficient in terms of the amount of food energy in for units of food energy out are the bigger ruminant animals, the red meat animals. So that's just worth bearing in mind. But beyond that, the nutritionists will tell us that 90 to 100 grams of meat a day, or 3 or 4 times a week, is perfectly adequate, and even better if it's mixed up with 1 or 2 serves of fish, although that raises awkward questions about the future of the world's fisheries under climate change and industrialised fishing practices. But there are options for getting that balance much better, and I suppose the flow-on would also apply to dairy foods. I imagine some of us in this audience, myself, for example, this morning at breakfast was tempted not by our usual Jalna yogurt, but my wife had bought Greek yogurt. So I had a serve that was 3 times larger because I like it. I try not to, but it just sort of happens. So, there are opportunities all the way through this to think more sensibly about what sort of balance we want and how to ensure that that's available to all people.
Barbara?
Slightly tangential, but part of how we design our cities. I'm becoming increasingly interested, and globally people are in community gardens and how we retrofit our cities with community gardens, certainly happening in some of our big global cities like London and New York, how we can bring fresh food much closer to home, but also how we can use our open spaces, which will be very important in a warmer environment to cool the city, that heat island effect, how we can use those also more productively. So we have a lot of grass cutters, for example, in Canberra out there, and it looks fantastic. I've had my students walk around the lake trying to envisage what that would look like if it was a whole series of productive spaces around fruit and vegetables and gardens instead of just lawns and grass cutters. So I just thought I'd throw that idea in because it's one of those examples where it's like a win-all if we go down that path.
And if we can change people's thinking too from that mindset of, well, here's a recipe book, I'm going to cook that, and I'm just off to the supermarket to get it, to rather being what's in the backyard, what's in the allotment, what's seasonal and accessible.
Or what's on your balcony of your new apartment. I've just bought a new apartment and I'm thinking it's got quite a good balcony, and I'm thinking, well, it's great to watch all these gardening shows about all these acreages and wonderful
Get a lot of
things.
zucchinis off the balcony.
I want to know how I could do that in my little space. So that's a new challenge.
Yeah, and I think of that Michael Pollan aphorism too. I think it's real food, mostly plants and not too much, which is a good guide. Now I think we've got a question up here. Yep.
Hi there. We were just talking before about conversations about health impacts, and it felt like it was mostly in a mitigative context, talking about preventing illnesses and deaths in the coming decades. I wanted to ask the panel about having these conversations in adaptive context. For example, you're speaking before about how you've been suffering from allergies in the autumn, and the Bureau is forecasting a warm winter this year in most of the country. I've noticed that we have these conversations on, in terms of extremes, like on extreme fire days, when heat waves roll through. Do you think that we could be having more of these conversations? And I'm interested to know what the panel thinks about who should be having these conversations, whether it should just be the Bureau, whether it should be healthcare providers, government.
I'm happy to.
Yeah, that's
okay.
Please
I
do.
might go as chair, another hat as chair of the ACT Climate Change Council. Last week, I think it was only last week, Minister Corbell released a direction statement for the government itself around developing a climate change adaptation strategy for the ACT, and identified 6 themes in that, so I just refer you to that. But they range right from the built environment through to landscape, water, energy, transport, and so across the across the spectrum, health and well-being. So I guess that's the first point. It's right across government and across the community that we're talking about. In terms of conversations, well, there certainly will be conversations in the ACT community following on from that launch, and the ACT Climate Change Council will be involved. I'm out speaking to the community councils, and I've just started that, but that's just part of the equation. University of Canberra, we're running a cities, here's a free plug, Cities and Climate Change course through the winter, starts in 2 weeks' time, but it's an example that's a course we would never have run in the past. But we're running it this year, and we have some significant enrolments already. So there is a genuine interest to have a conversation around these and learning around these issues.
I think there's a very interesting opinion piece by Julian Cribb in today's Canberra Times, in Times 2, about the credibility of scientists and how highly that rates with the general public. And apparently it even extends to science journalists who rate more highly than other journalists. But I think Julian makes actually a really interesting point that the general public has much more brains and willingness for this discussion than they are generally given credit for, and that it is a discussion that can take place at a wider basis. But Peter, what would you say?
Well, I was going to tie a couple of these things. I mean, the gentleman here, the woman in the middle, it's really about systems and how we change systems. I mean, we do most of our lives on autopilot because we get up in the morning, we have breakfast, we go to work, we get to work, we don't remember any of that because it's all happening on autopilot. And so we live in these systems which just flow. And it's the same thing with the design of Canberra. You know, the people who set up the design of Canberra set it up, and they were basing the transport system around motor cars. Although initially they did have buses, that all changed in anti-rationalist views of the 1980s. And so changing how we design cities is actually introducing new systems and new habits of how designers design urban planning, how architects design houses, how builders build. You know, they have to rethink how they're doing the building. So it's actually a massive effort. And a lot of the stuff around food production. I mean, that brings in the element of corporations and the role corporations are playing in our lives and how they're setting up systems which make life easy for them and good for them to make profit for their shareholders, but which don't necessarily actually benefit the rest of us directly. I mean, sure, we get access to food in supermarkets, but it means we don't get access to fresh vegetables off our balconies or in community gardens. Now, I'm sure that there's a transition towns movement in Canberra somewhere, and this is an example of how people are beginning to pull this stuff back out of the control of corporations. And then the questioner up the back, I mean, this whole thing about who do we have the conversations, this starts to talk to the heart of democracy and what it is to be living in a democracy and who should be making the decisions about what's happening to our city. And it shouldn't be the people who run corporations who are trying to arrange the system for their benefit. It should be us, the citizens, who are having the conversations about how we arrange the system for our benefit. And that also means that ultimately we're going to be designing more healthy systems where our overall well-being is better. And so there are things called citizens' juries which have been trialled in Perth and Victoria, and they are a demonstration of deliberative democracy or participatory democracy, where you get bunches of citizens together. Now, how you get the citizens together, there are a few ways of doing that, but they then start to talk through the issues. They're given information, they bring their own lived experience into the conversation. We have the conversation, they come up with recommendations that they can make to dialogue. So, for instance, the recent adaptation plan that's come out of the NT government, that may well have been influenced by the process that Sea Change did last year with their 2020 Vision project with the high schools, which was looking at these questions and then made a whole lot of recommendations for government. So that was another example of a sort of democratic process looking at our school kids, who after all are the people who are inheriting this planet from us.
I was just thinking, you bearded radical you, people should be in charge of how they want their cities to be.
That's true. Having said that, in Canberra, I have to say, and I've worked in Melbourne, Sydney, elsewhere, and it's almost one large deliberative democracy. This community is like 100. There's like 300,000 planners, and so I think, and there's remarkable access to our local politicians that I see in this city. The premiers, if you try and see the Premier of Victoria and New South Wales, you haven't got a hope. Here, the Chief Minister.
You can ring the Chief Minister tomorrow morning.
Extremely accessible. So I think we're doing pretty well in that sense.
Okay, I've got with the microphone up here. Yep.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the conversation so far. One of the things that's very clear is that we Canberrans and indeed all Australians are very fortunate on a global scale relative to the others, despite the problems that we face. And one of the elements of this year's federal budget that seems to have gone largely unremarked is the almost $8 billion cut over the next 5 years to the foreign aid budget. And the implications of that for our neighbours in particular and the countries around us in terms of health and their well-being concern me greatly, and I'm wondering what the panel think about that.
Tony, would you like to start with that?
Well, there are a couple of aspects that I'd like to comment on. The first is, and I suppose most people in the audience know it, but we're now looking like an extremely mean, rich country. I think we've dropped down to even below 0.5% of expenditure of our national budget on foreign aid. And that's happening at a crucial time as the world becomes more interdependent. So it's quite paradoxical, and it tells us something about this sort of barricaded mentality that is developing in this country with respect to protection of borders and the national interest, rather than trying to see what it will mean over the coming century and beyond to live within this greater Asia-Pacific region as an equally participating country. So that's very sad that that's happening for the moment, and hopefully it'll be reversed in future. But the other thing, of course, is that it reminds us that to the extent that development is being held back, and I don't just mean crude physical economic development, I'm talking about broader social, cultural, political development, which we should be supporting by whatever means we can as a contributing country. But to the extent that that's held back, geopolitical instability is likely to arise within the region. And that's starting to attract the attention of a number of concerned parties, including the defence sector in this country, and indeed in many countries around the world, who are starting to say, look, the big flow-on effects from food shortages, from violation of river flows across national boundaries, from rising seas around coastlines, from increasing population pressures, and so on, are going to create situations of greater tension and conflict. There will be some struggle for resources in parts of the world quite near to us. Our defence sector is aware of it. They had the Strategic Policy Institute publish a paper on it for them last year to help them think about it, and they've now set up a unit called their Global Change Unit to try and explore what it means for the military. The Americans announced quite recently that they too were going to put new effort via the defence sector into understanding the threats to geopolitical stability and the security of the US. That's been quickly stymied by Congress, who last week passed a motion forbidding the expenditure of any additional monies from any budgetary source on issues to do with climate change in the defence sector, because you know who controls the Congress. So that country's having a real struggle to do some of these more progressive things as they begin to understand the enormous risks on that larger scale that are quite likely to emerge around the world. So coming back to your question, our tightening of our pockets in Australia is an unfortunate negative contribution to moving into a world where we might just be able to stave off the more extreme forms of tension and conflict that will otherwise arise as a result of climate change in concert with all those other things that human pressures are now resulting in.
Mm-hmm.
And
I agree.
Just to quickly chuck in
Yes.
there, I mean, one of the things is that there are already incredible inequities in this world. And one of the dreams of having a better world is that we in the industrialised sector are consuming less so that people in the developing world can consume more. But the whole point is that at some point it would be nice to get to a point where every person on the planet can have about the same. And that means that in Australia we are going to have to contract our usage of resources. Now, that doesn't mean we have to go back and live in caves. And in fact, if we don't contract our resources, we're more likely to end up going back to have to live in caves. It means that we've got to do things smarter, use less energy to do the same amount, and perhaps not live quite so extravagantly. But that's not necessarily a hard thing. But it does require us to change how we think about how we're living, and that's difficult. And yes.
Barbara.
That's fine. Look, I agree with what's been said. I think what really astounds me is it's not only mean and you know, totally irresponsible to be doing that in my view, but it's also remarkably stupid. In that, you know, even if you came from a totally self-interested perspective, we will have climate refugees on our doorstep with our islands, with our rising sea levels. They're not going to go away because we've removed it from the budget. They will continue to increase, and we will not have a small problem on our hands. We will have a very large problem on our hands, and it will be largely of our own making because we haven't joined and been collaborative neighbours and partners in trying to solve these issues now.
Now, I can't see where the microphone is on this side. Have we got a question on this side? Oh, sorry. Perhaps we'll go to you over here. Sorry about that. I thought the microphone was already in place. But, yeah, you've got the mic up there.
So you talked about the typical Canberran jumping on their bike and going off to buy organic vegetables, but that same Canberran is living in a region of the world with a high degree of natural climate variability, and indeed one of the only areas in the world where natural variability peaks in summer, not in winter. So do you think that our perceptions of ourselves as quite informed and receptive to these ideas and adept at coping means that we've left ourselves vulnerable to these quite basic impacts such as heat stress and bushfire risk, and perceive these as things that are going to happen to other people and not to us?
I could start with that. Goes to the heart of behavioural change and perception. I've just started with an electric bike, so I'm seeing the city from quite a different perspective. And trying to cross Northbourne Avenue at 8 a.m. near the ABC studios is somewhat challenging, along with all the other students going across at the same time. So some of it is perception, because in fact it's very easy to ride your bike, I think, around. And even from my experience, it's quite easy to ride your bike around town. We could do better. Some of it is about perception. If you actually look at the evidence, we're increasing what we call active travel in this town, believe it or not. And that's to do with walkability of a city and cycling. So the trend is starting to change. I'm not sure what else we can do except to try and promote and make it safe. I think safety is really important. I think lighting is really important. So a lot of it does come down to very mundane, detailed design. Job I once had was at the City of Melbourne managing project delivery, where all I did was look at all the footpaths and the cycle paths around town. And I learnt a great deal and became a much better planner as a result. So that attention to detail on the ground is actually important. What that means is you actually have to invest in maintenance and that kind of infrastructure. Mm. The Planning Institute of Australia has put out in partnership with the National Heart Foundation and the Australian Local Government Association, so a slightly broader answer to your question. That's quite a unique partnership, which is a good thing to start with. Put out just for your reference, a healthy places and spaces guide for decision making around these issues. And it also emphasises that, so, you know, if you're going to design a city so people will start to become more active and come out of their car and start to use active travel, as we say, then we need to design it so it's good for children as well as good for older people. In fact, they argue if you design it for children, you've probably solved it for most people. And so I think part of it's education, part of it's investments in detailed design, and part of it is, I suspect, leadership too. Just get out there on your bike. And
Renormalise biking.
Yes.
Indeed. Yep, to you.
The panel before talked about the idea that science can solve all our problems, and the belief of some of our parliamentarians and probably people in the community that that's so. So we now talk about sustainable development. Do you think that's now a greenwash term and it's actually gives the wrong impression to many people? Because when we develop, we're always impacting the world around us. Mm. So I suppose my question is, should we be using another term that more correctly reflects the least worst work that we do?
Mm. I personally talk about ecologically sustainable development because I think it's true. We do have to define what we mean by sustainable development. And when I talk about it, I mean ecologically sustainable development, not like Joe Horry, who talks about economically sustainable development, who's got a different idea of what goes on. And I think, I mean, it comes back also to not only us being clear what we're on about, but holding our parliamentarians to account for their language and what do they mean. And one of the things, I mean, working in this field, you can get depressed because it's pretty big and it sometimes seems to be insoluble. However, we know from psychological studies that the antidote for depression is doing things, so getting active, so coming along to meetings like this, going out, having conversations with your friends, but also changing what you do. But one of the powerful things that we have in a democracy, and I'm not saying that Australia is a democracy, that's another conversation, but one of the powerful things we do have is the capacity to vote. And so, given what's just happened with this budget, because what this budget has shown us is that if a government decides it wants to do something, it can do it. And it doesn't matter what the rest of us think. And so if the government decided it wanted to tackle climate change and global warming, it would do it. To use Richard Dennis's analogy, governments don't do stuff they don't want to do. Our role, our job as citizens, is to make governments do what we want them to do for us. We have a vote. I think we should be making the next federal election all about climate change. Because if we think about polls of what people worry about, you know, they worry about jobs, they worry about the economy, they worry about healthcare, they worry about education, and then somewhere down around 7, 8, 9, they worry about the environment and global warming. But as we've heard today, global warming is actually going to feed up into jobs in the economy and healthcare. And so it really is worrying people, and I think most people get this. Mm-hmm. So if we have an election campaign around the environment and about doing something meaningful and sensible about global warming, then we can exercise our vote. But we, the citizens, have to make it an issue.
Mm. But I think you actually raise also an interesting point about regulation and labelling. We had a chat just before the conversation here started on stage. I think Barbara mentioned ventilation, and Barbara, you might like to talk about mud brick houses and how they fit with our rating system for environmental sustainability.
But yes, it's a good example. We can get locked into systems that we end up ticking boxes. We don't necessarily get the outcomes we want. And so the Green Star rating system, some of you would know about this, but the various rating systems around the country about energy efficiency. And I grew up in a mud brick house, fantastic place, cool in the summer, warm in the winter, and yet mud brick fails the energy rating system in Australia right now because it doesn't have insulation, because of course you don't need insulation with mud bricks, and so it can't tick that box. So that's actually had an immediate flow on impact to the mud brick industry, who are now finding it struggling very hard to survive because they can't get that rating. Now that's a ridiculous outcome and it needs to be fixed. Mm-hmm. So we do need to think through those issues. Just want to mention one thing. There is a deeper issue, and this could take us for the next 2 days. Gentleman at the back mentioned Nature at the beginning of the discussion. There's also a very good article in Nature earlier this year by Bob Constanza, who's Professor at ANU in Sustainability, Beyond GDP. And I think that actually goes to the heart of what we're talking about. You know, what is it that we see as a healthy society? What is it that we see as a measure of progress in our society? And is it GDP? If we could get a budget that was beyond GDP, that would be, for me, would be even a better outcome. It would actually start to transform our society.
And on the way to Tony, Bob Costanza puts out a journal called Solutions, which has got lots of stories about things which are happening in the world already to change it. And so if you want to get a bit of inspiration and optimism into your depression,
and
subscribe.
Tony, you wanted to make a comment?
Well, I was just interested in the initial question about this word sustainability and how useful, how informative, how appropriate it might be. It's been co-opted on many fronts and misused. Mm. You can have sustainable dentistry by taking fluoride out of drinking water. If you talk to many people, and apologies to my colleagues who might be in the health sector, but if you talk to many people in our formal health sector, they think it's about sustainable funding for the healthcare system. So what Peter said is very important, that we have to rethink that word in that bigger sense, that it's about sustaining the ecological processes out there in the world at large that are the ultimate determinants of what is available to us as a living species to keep us alive, to keep us well, to keep us socially cohesive, to keep us happy. That's what ecologically sustainability ought to be about. Barbara and I were at a discussion last week in the early framing of Australia's Sustainability Development Goals in Melbourne. And under that rubric of economics, the first target that came up was to achieve economically sustainable, wait for it, growth. Now, you can fabricate a defence of the word growth and say, well, like Alice, it depends on how you use it, what it means. But the discussion actually led, and it was a little first step, I think, in the right direction to replace the word growth in our draft with prosperity, do you remember? Which was seen as a more all-encompassing sort of term and not just geared to that notion of physical bigness, big Australia, lots of money, SUVs, all those sorts of things. So we need a good public discussion on sustainability. And wouldn't it be nice if on the ABC 7 o'clock news we didn't have Alan Kohler every night telling us how the BHP price had moved by 1/4 cent. Wasn't that exciting?
Like Alan, actually.
We could be having a little segment on, you know, the world's and the nation's climatic and environmental conditions. There are more stories in any one day than would fill an Alan Kohler slot. And we ought to be hearing them. They ought to be part of public discussion.
I guess, can I just very quickly, whatever word we use, it will be misused. So we just have to, I think we have to define very clearly what it means, because the latest word after sustainable development is resilience. And, you know, and I guess people are seeing that as perhaps a better way of describing how we move from one state to another in working with nature and being able to adapt and all those concepts. But I could see that also being, I already hear people saying, oh, I'm sick of resilience. I think of another word. So I think we just need to be very clear. Ian Lowe, who was Australian Scientist of the Year, another professor, I think he's at Griffith, was at ANU, he redefined, and I really like the way he did. I'll do this really quickly. So often in sustainable development, we have 3 circles, and they intersect in the middle, and we say that's sustainable development. But often that's the lowest common denominator where they meet. You've got environment, social, and economic, 3 circles. The way Ian Lowe portrayed it was, which I really like, is the outer circle is the planet, next circle is the community, and the one in the middle is the economy. So without a planet, there is no community, and without a community, there is no economy. So the economy is not a thing in itself. It's dependent on all those. So for me, that's a much more one of interdependence, and that's how I like to think about sustainable development. So I think it's how you actually define the concept that's really important.
And I second Tony's motion.
Well, you might like to take that up with Mark Scott and see how far we go.
Okay.
I can introduce you to the heads of news.
Please.
Yes, we can make that happen. We've got time for just a couple more questions, very patiently up the back. Thank you.
I'd like to ask Barbara a question about the future of urban transport. We're almost universally addicted to our internal combustion engines, more politely referred to as private cars or automobiles. Now they're driven by things called fossil fuels, which are chains of carbon atoms attached to hydrogen atoms. Now, all the work is done by the hydrogen oxidation, and all the trouble is caused by the carbon atoms. And we see that's what happens in climate change. What we need to do is to start thinking outside the box and think of a better atom to attach hydrogen to than carbon. And that atom is called nitrogen. And the combination of nitrogen and hydrogen gives you ammonia. You wouldn't think that had much to do with transport, but in New Orleans in the 1890s, they drove their streetcars on ammonia. And in Brussels, during the war, they used ammonia for buses because all the diesel was absorbed by the Nazi for their war effort. So ammonia is a feasible molecule for driving automobiles, buses, trains. It's been shown to be attractive. There's a well-established ammonia industry. There are methods now of synthesizing ammonia from sunshine, water, and nitrogen using hydrolysis of water. And this is going ahead in Canada now. So why don't we start a new movement for a sustainable mobility program and equip our cars, light rails, buses with ammonia? The technology is there. The political impetus isn't there. And there were huge objections from the fossil fuel industry because it would do them out of jobs. But if it's widely applied, it could reduce carbon emissions at the order of 20% at least. And nitrogen can also be used for the generation of electricity. Canberra's done wonderful work in its solar thermal generation, its wind farms and so on. We could start a new industrial sustainable revolution in which there were zero carbon emissions. Why don't we get on and do it?
Barbara, what do you think?
Well, I'm all for innovation. I'm certainly not an expert on what you've just put, so I'll take it and have a look at that, but that's about as much as I can do on that particular issue. But in terms of welcoming innovation and supporting innovation, I'll be the first person to be looking at that. In Canberra, as I said before, we've got the Energy Change Institute at ANU, looking at a whole range of energy sources. We've got a government that's committed to renewable energy in the future. So if you've ever got a scenario to look at those different options, you've got one now. So that's a good thing. And maybe you should put that down in writing and send it into the Climate Council. Maybe I could suggest that to you.
Yeah, but I think, if I can just tell you very quickly a really remarkable anecdote about the attack on science and thinking that we're sometimes under. I read out a text from a listener just last week, which was about acknowledging the CSIRO's work in the longer range and funding questions, and I made a passing comment that CSIRO had been responsible for a remarkable range of innovations. My producer took a phone call from someone who said, "Now, why has she said that? Can she name anything they've ever done?" And my producer, as it happens, is married to a scientist, and she snapped back with, "Well, they invented AeroGuard, and that's had a fairly significant impact, and what about Wi-Fi?" And the caller was very taken aback, but we thought to ourselves afterwards, how remarkable that a passing comment about the level of innovation that CSIRO is responsible for could produce an attack on, well, the ABC, on CSIRO, casting doubt on the fact that that was an actuality. It's remarkable.
I feel we're living in medieval times at the moment.
Yeah, I was astonished. Last question, I think, because we're just about out of time, but yes, in the middle.
Yes, over the last year I've been back and forth from Moores Creek trying to stop the Whitehaven coal mine, and I've met a lot of people there, young people, who are overwhelmed, depressed, angry, really furious, intergenerational conflict. And thanks for your comments that getting active helps speed our depression. I'm wondering if you could expand on what I'm saying a little bit about the psychological impacts of climate change on us all.
I'm very glad you asked that, because that's a really interesting question. Mental health risks from climate change as we face up to very big challenges. Tony?
Well, it's a big deal, and as we've not sufficiently recognised, it's already a big deal within the community at large. Mental health is the great Cinderella problem of the burden of poor health within our community, and seemingly increasing for a number of reasons to do with the sorts of things that Barbara knows more about than I do. But in relation to climate change, we could talk for a long while about the ways in which that is impinging and will impinge on mental health, and obvious examples are to do with the immediate losses, family and property, and value losses after extreme weather events. But our best recent experience in Australia is really to do with rural communities during the prolonged drought in the first decade of this century, where it was observed that some communities were relatively resilient. We've heard that word a little while ago. Others were not. They didn't have the same social capital, the same strength, and were much more prone to contraction, disintegration, bickering, and mental health problems became apparent in some of these rural communities at different levels. And that was because they were living in a land that had become less productive as a result of climatic change. So I think that's a pretty good example in Australia of one of the contexts. But yes, there is a real concern about how this might be affecting the worldview, the sense of hopelessness perhaps and despair in some of the oncoming younger generation. And we need to be pretty alert to that, because a lot of this effort is going to have to depend on them.
Peter, would you like to make a comment as a GP?
Well, not as a GP, but there was some research done during the Cold War in the 1980s in the States and Australia, where they looked at a whole lot of youth, and they looked at their reactions to the Cold War and their feelings of threat from nuclear holocaust. And the thing that sticks in my mind is that the children or the young people who had parents who were actively involved in the political process or in the peace movement were much more optimistic about the future than the children of the people who weren't. And so it comes back to the action is the best antidote or antidote to depression. And in clinical practice, you notice there's the same things. You know, there are various issues with depression as a clinical entity. But in helping people to get better, one of the key things is to getting people doing something, you know, anything. Just get out of bed in the morning, look at the sunshine. And so I think, again, for the people in the audience who've got kids, the more active they are involved, the more their kids see they're active, even if they go through the teenage years where they don't want to know about it. They'll come out the other end a lot more purposeful and a lot more switched on and a lot more hopeful about life.
Barbara, final comment from you, perhaps?
Yes, well, maybe the way we design our cities, if we are going to have a hotter environment, for example, then we need to be making sure that we make it easy for people, older and younger people, to be able to still live active lives. And so that's part of being part of it and part of getting out there. Part of the despondency, I think, is towards the political parties. You know, I have a daughter in her early 20s. I teach 18-year-olds. Not particularly interested in political parties anymore. They're interested in... I don't see a despondency, though, in their interest in wanting to contribute in other ways. They just do it in a different way. So maybe I'm just skewed, though. I'm surrounded by these optimistic people. Of course, free access to education would help as well, but that's another matter.
Gosh, we could there go on for another several hours. But we have actually reached the end of our time, and it's been a terrifically interesting discussion. I'm always astonished by how quickly that time elapses. It's an hour and a half of full discussion on climate change and health. Professor Barbara Norman, Dr. Peter Tait, and Professor Tony McMichael, many thanks. Thank you.